My entire family vanished exactly 1 hour before I was supposed to walk down the aisle. 63 people who had confirmed their attendance, including my parents, my siblings, my aunts, uncles, and cousins, simply disappeared without a trace. When my fiancé Marcus, a senior FBI agent, received an encrypted message on his phone at that precise moment, I discovered that the wedding I had spent a year planning was never about celebrating love. It was about exposing the truth that my family had spent 28 years hiding from me. What I uncovered in the following hours would shatter everything I believed about my identity, my past, and the people I had trusted most. But it would also set me free in ways I never imagined possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of my wedding began exactly as I had imagined it would for the past 14 months. Sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains of the bridal suite at the Riverside estate, casting golden patterns across the ivory dress hanging near the window. The dress was stunning, a custom design with delicate lace sleeves and a cathedral train that had taken 6 months to create. Every detail of this day had been meticulously planned, from the pale pink roses in the centerpieces to the string quartet that would play during the ceremony to the custom menu that accommodated everyone's dietary restrictions. I had been awake since 5:30 that morning, unable to sleep through the excitement and nervous energy that comes with knowing your entire life is about to change. My bridesmaids, my best friend Jennifer and my younger sister Claire, had arrived at 7 with coffee and pastries, their voices filling the suite with laughter, and the kind of easy conversation that comes from years of friendship and shared history. The hairstylist arrived at 8, followed by the makeup artist at 9:30. By 11 o'clock, I was sitting in the salon chair watching my reflection transform into the bride I had envisioned. My dark hair swept into an elegant updo, my makeup subtle but radiant. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock. Guests would begin arriving at 1:30. The timeline was printed on cards that the wedding coordinator carried in her leather portfolio. Every minute accounted for, every transition planned. I had reviewed that timeline so many times over the past year that I could recite it from memory. Cocktail hour at 3:15. Reception entrance at 4:30. First dance at 5. Dinner at 5:30. Cake cutting at 7. Everything organized, everything perfect. Marcus had texted me at 9 that morning, breaking our agreement not to communicate on the wedding day before the ceremony. His message was brief but warm, telling me he loved me and could not wait to see me walking toward him. We had been together for 3 years, engaged for 14 months. He was 34 years old, 8 years older than me, with the kind of steady, protective presence that made me feel safe in a world that often felt chaotic and uncertain. He worked for the FBI in the Criminal Investigative Division, specializing in financial crimes and organized corruption. His work was demanding and sometimes dangerous, requiring long hours and occasional travel, but he was committed to it in a way I found admirable. My family had been somewhat reserved about Marcus when we first started dating. My father, Robert Chen, had asked careful questions about his background, his career trajectory, his intentions. My mother, Patricia, had been warmer but still cautious, making comments about the challenges of being married to someone in law enforcement. My older brother David had been quietly skeptical, asking me several times if I was certain Marcus was the right choice. At the time, I had attributed their concerns to normal parental protectiveness and sibling caution. Looking back now, I understand their questions were about something else entirely. By noon I was dressed and ready, standing in front of the full-length mirror in the bridal suite, while Jennifer adjusted my veil and Claire dabbed away tears she claimed were happy but looked more complicated. The wedding coordinator, a efficient woman named Sandra who had planned over 300 weddings in her career, knocked on the door at 12:15 to confirm that everything was proceeding on schedule. The florist had finished the ceremony arrangements. The caterers were setting up in the kitchen. The string quartet was warming up in the garden. The photographer was capturing detail shots of the venue. At 12:45, Sandra returned with an update that made me smile. Early guests were already arriving, eager and excited. My parents had texted to say they were on their way from the hotel where most of my extended family was staying. Everything was unfolding exactly as planned. I felt a wave of gratitude for all the people who had worked to make this day possible, for all the love and support that had brought us to this moment. At 1:15, I sat down with Jennifer and Claire for a quiet moment before the chaos of the ceremony began. We had champagne that none of us really drank, too nervous and excited to do more than take small sips. We reminisced about my relationship with Marcus, about the night we met at a charity fundraiser for youth education programs, about his proposal on a beach in Maine during a weekend trip we had taken to escape the summer heat of Washington. Claire told embarrassing stories from our childhood. Jennifer gave a short speech about friendship and how happy she was to see me marrying someone who clearly adored me. At 1:35, Sandra knocked again. This time her expression was different. The professional calm had cracked slightly, revealing something that looked like confusion or concern. She asked if she could speak with me privately. Jennifer and Claire exchanged glances but stepped out onto the balcony, giving us space. Sandra closed the door and turned to face me with an expression I could not quite read. She said that there seemed to be some kind of delay with my family. Several of them had not yet arrived from the hotel. She had called my mother's cell phone twice with no answer. She had tried my father and my brother with the same result. The hotel had confirmed that the entire Chen family party had checked out that morning as planned, but no one had seen them since approximately 11:30, when they loaded their luggage into cars in the hotel parking lot. I felt the first flutter of concern but pushed it aside. Traffic, I suggested. An accident on the highway causing delays. Dead cell phone batteries. There were dozens of reasonable explanations for why a group of people might be temporarily unreachable. Sandra nodded, clearly wanting to believe this explanation, but her expression remained troubled. She told me she would continue trying to reach them, and asked if I wanted to delay the start of the ceremony by 15 minutes to allow time for them to arrive. I agreed to the delay, still unconcerned enough to joke that my family had always had questionable time management skills. Sandra left to inform the other vendors and the guests who had already arrived. I walked out onto the balcony where Jennifer and Claire were waiting, and explained the situation. They both frowned but agreed that it was probably nothing serious. Claire called my mother's phone herself. No answer. She tried David. Nothing. Jennifer tried my father. Voicemail. By 1:50, the concern had escalated to something closer to worry. Sandra returned to report that she had expanded her efforts. She had contacted the hotel manager directly, who confirmed that the Chun family party, comprising 63 people including my parents, my 2 siblings and their families, my maternal grandmother, and various aunts, uncles and cousins, had all checked out between 11 and 11:30 that morning. Security footage showed them loading vehicles and departing the property. But none of them had arrived at the venue, which was only a 25-minute drive from the hotel. Sandra had also contacted the local police non-emergency line to inquire about accidents or traffic incidents on the route between the hotel and the venue. Nothing had been reported. She had tried every phone number on my family contact list. Not a single person had answered. 63 people, all suddenly and completely unreachable at the exact same time. I felt my chest tighten with something that went beyond worry into the territory of real fear. This was not normal. This was not explainable by traffic or dead batteries or poor planning. Something was wrong. Very wrong. I tried to think of rational explanations. A surprise they had planned for the reception that required them all to be elsewhere temporarily. A miscommunication about the ceremony time. Anything that made sense of why my entire family would simultaneously become unreachable on my wedding day. At 2 o'clock, the scheduled ceremony time, I was standing in the bridal suite with my phone pressed to my ear, listening to my mother's voicemail message for the 7th time, as if repetition might somehow produce a different result. Jennifer was on her phone attempting to reach my cousin Amanda, who was supposed to be a bridesmaid but had not appeared. Claire was texting frantically with my brother's wife, Stephanie, getting no responses. Sandra was coordinating with the venue staff and the wedding party, trying to determine the best course of action. Marcus had been informed of the situation by his best man, his FBI colleague named Derek Foster. At 2:10, Marcus came to the bridal suite, breaking tradition by seeing me before the ceremony, though given the circumstances, tradition seemed absurdly irrelevant. He was dressed in his tuxedo, looking handsome and concerned in equal measure. When he wrapped his arms around me, I felt some of the panic recede slightly, replaced by the sense of safety his presence always provided. He told me that he had personally called the local police to file a missing persons report for 63 individuals. The desk sergeant had initially been skeptical, suggesting this was likely a misunderstanding or a prank, but Marcus's FBI credentials and his insistence on the seriousness of the situation had prompted the department to send 2 officers to the venue to take formal statements. He had also contacted several of his colleagues at the bureau, asking them to make informal inquiries through their networks about any incidents involving large groups that might not have been officially reported yet. We made the decision at 2:20 to delay the ceremony indefinitely. Sandra made an announcement to the guests who had arrived, explaining that there had been a family emergency and asking everyone to please wait while we sorted out the situation. Most people were understanding, though I could see confusion and concern rippling through the crowd. Marcus's family, who comprised most of the guests since my family had not arrived, offered to help in any way possible. His mother came to the bridal suite to sit with me, holding my hand and speaking in soothing tones that I barely heard through the static of my own thoughts. At 2:40, the police officers arrived and began taking statements. They asked detailed questions about my family, their last known locations, their vehicles, their typical behaviors. They asked if there had been any family conflicts or reasons why someone might choose not to attend the wedding. They asked about financial problems, legal troubles, anything that might explain a coordinated disappearance. I answered as best I could, but the truth was that my family had seemed completely normal. No conflicts, no troubles, nothing that would predict this inexplicable vanishing. The officers were professional but clearly puzzled. One of them, a woman named Officer Martinez, said gently that in her 15 years of police work, she had never encountered a situation quite like this. Families did not simply disappear without reason. There was always an explanation. They would find it. At 2:55, exactly 1 hour after my ceremony should have begun, Marcus's phone buzzed with an incoming message. He glanced at the screen and his entire body went rigid. His expression transformed from concern to something I had never seen on his face before. Something that looked like recognition mixed with anger and fear. He excused himself abruptly and stepped out of the bridal suite, phone pressed to his ear, his voice too low for me to hear what he was saying. I followed him into the hallway, my wedding dress rustling with each step, feeling ridiculous and terrified in equal measure. He was standing near a window overlooking the garden where we should have been married by now, his back to me, his shoulders tense. When he turned around, his face had gone pale beneath his tan. He said my name, his voice careful and strained. Then he said something that made the floor seem to drop away beneath my feet. He said that he had just received classified information through FBI channels. He said that my family had not disappeared randomly or accidentally. He said that they had been placed into emergency protective custody, approximately 90 minutes ago, by federal agents acting on intelligence that suggested imminent danger to their lives. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I stared at him, unable to process what he was saying. Protective custody. Federal agents. Imminent danger. These words belonged in movies or news reports about criminals and terrorists, not in any sentence that included my family. My family consisted of normal, law-abiding people. My father was a financial consultant. My mother was a retired teacher. My brother worked in pharmaceutical sales. My sister was a graphic designer. These were not people who required federal protection from danger. Marcus took my hands and told me to sit down. His voice had shifted into the tone he used when dealing with victims or witnesses in his work, calm and controlled but underlaid with urgency. He said that what he was about to tell me would be difficult to hear, and that I needed to prepare myself. He said that everything I believed about my family's background was incomplete. He said that my father had not always been a financial consultant. He said that 28 years ago, before I was born, my father had been something else entirely. Something that had finally caught up with him today, hours before I was supposed to marry an FBI agent. I pulled my hands away from his, anger flaring through the confusion. What was he talking about? What did he mean my father had been something else? And why was he only telling me this now, on our wedding day, after my entire family had vanished? Had he known something was wrong? Had he known they were in danger? Marcus's expression was pained. He said that he had not known. Not specifically. Not until this morning when the encrypted message came through FBI channels, alerting relevant personnel about a coordinated federal operation. He said that the operation had been in planning for weeks, but had been accelerated suddenly based on intelligence about a credible and immediate threat. He said that the timing, the fact that it happened hours before our wedding, was not coincidental. It was precisely because of our wedding, because of his position at the FBI, that the threat had become active. I stood there in my wedding dress, in the hallway of the venue where I should have been celebrating the beginning of my marriage, and felt my entire understanding of reality fracturing. My father had a hidden past. My family was in protective custody. Federal agents had evacuated 63 people because of a threat connected to something that happened before I was born. And Marcus, the man I was supposed to marry, had received classified information about my family that he was now sharing with me in fragments because he was bound by security protocols and institutional regulations. I asked the only question that seemed to matter in that moment. What had my father been? What had he done that required my entire family to disappear on my wedding day? Marcus looked at me with an expression that combined compassion and professional distance. He said that my father had been an accountant for an organization that was, at the time, under federal investigation for racketeering, money laundering, fraud, and connections to violent crime. He said that my father had turned state's witness 29 years ago, providing testimony and documentation that had helped convict several high-ranking members of that organization. He said that my father and mother had entered witness protection shortly after their testimony, emerging with new identities and a new life in a different part of the country. He said that I was born 4 months after they entered witness protection. He said that the name on my birth certificate, the identity I had carried my entire life, was not my family's original name. He said that everything I knew about my family's history before my birth had been carefully constructed fiction designed to protect us from retaliation by people who had spent decades in prison because of my father's testimony. And he said that those people, or individuals connected to them, had apparently learned about our wedding and had recognized an opportunity for revenge. An FBI agent marrying into the protected witness's family, the ceremony publicized through normal wedding announcements and social media posts, had provided information that allowed dangerous people to locate a family they had been searching for across nearly 3 decades. I felt my legs give out. I sat down hard on the carpeted hallway floor, my expensive wedding dress pooling around me, my carefully styled hair beginning to come loose from its pins, my makeup probably running from tears I had not realized I was crying. Everything I knew was a lie. My name was not my name. My family's history was fiction. My father was not the man I had believed him to be. And my wedding, the day I had planned for over a year, had inadvertently exposed my family to people who wanted them dead. Marcus knelt beside me, trying to offer comfort, but I could not process his presence. I could not process anything except the terrible weight of understanding that was settling over me. My family had disappeared because of me. Because I had fallen in love with an FBI agent. Because I had wanted a traditional wedding with announcements and a website and social media posts. Because I had been so naive and trusting and oblivious to the reality that my parents had apparently been living with for 28 years. Through the window behind us, I could see the garden where white chairs sat in empty rows, waiting for a ceremony that would never happen. The flowers I had chosen so carefully were already beginning to wilt in the afternoon heat. The string quartet had packed up and left an hour ago. Guests were filing out, returning to their cars, leaving behind the celebration that had transformed into crisis. My wedding day was over before it had even begun, and I had no idea who I actually was or what happened next. Officer Martinez appeared in the hallway and said that federal agents had arrived at the venue and needed to speak with both Marcus and me immediately. She said they had information about my family's location and status. She said they needed to discuss security protocols and next steps. Her voice was gentle but her eyes were serious. The look of someone who understood that my world had just been turned inside out and would never quite fit back together the same way. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady, my wedding dress suddenly feeling like a costume from someone else's life. Marcus offered his arm for support, but I shook my head. I needed to walk on my own. I needed to face whatever came next without leaning on anyone. without assuming that anything I believed was true or stable or reliable. If my entire identity was constructed fiction, if my family had been living in hiding for my entire life, if the man I was supposed to marry had been part of an institution that knew things about my family that I did not, then I could not trust anything or anyone until I understood what was actually real. As I followed Officer Martinez down the hallway toward whatever federal agents were waiting to explain my family's disappearance, and my fake identity, and the danger that had finally caught up with us after 28 years, I felt something shifting inside me. Something beneath the shock and fear and betrayal. It felt like anger, but it was colder and more focused than simple rage. It was the beginning of determination. The beginning of refusing to be a passive victim of circumstances I had not chosen or created. The beginning of deciding that if everything I had believed was a lie, then I would discover the truth, whatever it took and whatever it cost. My wedding day had ended before it started, but something else was beginning. Something that would require me to become someone I had never imagined I could be. Someone strong enough to face the truth about my family's past and my own identity. Someone capable of protecting myself and the people I loved from dangers I was only beginning to understand. Someone who would not spend the rest of her life living in the shadow of my father's choices, or the FBI's secrets, or anyone else's version of who I was supposed to be. The federal agents were waiting in Sandra's office. Their expressions professionally neutral, but their presence radiating authority and urgency. As I stepped through the doorway in my wedding dress, leaving behind the last remnants of the life I had thought I was building, I made myself a promise. I would find my family. I would uncover the truth. And I would never again allow anyone to hide who I was from me, no matter what they believed they were protecting me from. My name might be fake, my history might be fiction, but my determination was real. And it was just beginning. The federal agents introduced themselves with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to entering crisis situations and taking control. The first was Agent Sarah Brennan, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and graying blonde hair pulled into a tight bun. She wore a dark suit that seemed designed to project authority without drawing attention. Her partner was Agent Thomas Rivera, younger, perhaps early 30s, with the alert posture of someone trained to assess threats in every environment. They both carried credentials that they displayed briefly before gesturing for Marcus and me to sit down in the chairs facing Sandra's desk. Sandra herself had been asked to leave her own office, along with Officer Martinez and the other local police officer. This was now a federal matter, Agent Brennan explained, and the information they needed to share was classified at a level that required strict control over who had access. She apologized for the disruption to my wedding day with a tone that suggested she had delivered similar apologies in different contexts many times before and understood they were inadequate but necessary. I sat down in the chair, my wedding dress making soft rustling sounds that seemed absurdly loud in the tense silence of the room. Marcus sat beside me, his body angled slightly toward mine in a protective gesture that I both appreciated and resented. I wanted protection, but I also wanted answers, and I was not certain those two desires were compatible in this situation. Agent Brennan remained standing, positioning herself where she could see both of us clearly, while Agent Rivera moved to stand near the door, presumably to prevent interruptions. Agent Brennan began speaking in a measured tone that conveyed both sympathy and professional detachment. She said that my family was safe and secure in a federal facility, approximately 2 hours from our current location. All 63 individuals had been successfully evacuated from the hotel that morning based on credible intelligence about an imminent threat to their lives. The operation had been conducted with minimal notice to prevent any possibility of information leaking to hostile parties. My parents had been informed of the situation at 11 o'clock that morning and had been given exactly 30 minutes to gather the entire extended family and prepare for immediate departure. They had not been permitted to contact anyone outside the evacuation group, including me, because any communication could have been intercepted and could have compromised both their safety and the security of the operation. I absorbed this information in fragments, my mind struggling to process the reality that my parents had known for hours that they would not be attending my wedding and had been forbidden from telling me. They had watched me get ready that morning through text messages and phone calls, knowing they were about to disappear. Knowing I would be standing at a venue waiting for them, knowing I would be terrified and confused and devastated. The fact that they had made that choice, even under federal orders, felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than any of the revelations about false identities and hidden pasts. Agent Brennan continued, explaining that the threat against my family had emerged from intelligence gathered during an ongoing investigation into organized crime networks with roots stretching back several decades. Without going into operational details that remained classified, she said that certain individuals connected to the organization my father had testified against 29 years ago had recently been released from prison. These individuals had maintained connections to active criminal networks and had apparently spent their incarceration period planning retaliation against those they blamed for their convictions. My father's testimony had been particularly damaging to the organization's leadership. He had provided financial records that demonstrated systematic fraud, money laundering, and connections between legitimate businesses and violent criminal enterprises. His documentation had been meticulous and devastating, leading to convictions that carried sentences of 25 to 30 years. Several of those sentences were now complete, and the individuals who had served them had emerged from prison with both the motivation and the resources to pursue revenge. The FBI had been monitoring these individuals since their release, Agent Brennan explained, tracking their communications and movements through various investigative techniques. For several months, there had been no indication that they had located my family or had any active plans for retaliation. The Witness Protection Program had been successful in providing my parents with a new identity and a secure life far from their original location. But approximately 6 weeks ago, shortly after Marcus and I had sent out wedding invitations and launched our wedding website, the monitored communications had changed. Agent Rivera stepped forward and added details to the timeline. He explained that wedding announcements, particularly those posted online through wedding planning websites and social media, contained significant amounts of identifying information. Our wedding website had included my full name, Marcus's full name and his occupation with the FBI, the date and location of our wedding, and photographs of both of us. My social media accounts, which I had not thought to make private because I had nothing to hide, included photographs of my parents and siblings, tagged with their names and occasional location information. Someone within the criminal network had apparently been conducting systematic searches of social media and public records, looking for any trace of the family that had disappeared into witness protection nearly 3 decades ago. They had been searching for my father's face, despite aging and the passage of time. When photographs of me appeared alongside wedding announcements that included references to my parents, someone had recognized a resemblance. Facial recognition software, increasingly accessible and sophisticated, had been used to compare my features and my parents' features with old photographs from before they entered witness protection. The match had been strong enough to warrant further investigation by the criminal network. They had apparently begun surveillance of my family approximately 3 weeks ago, watching their routines, confirming their identities, and planning an operation that would maximize impact while minimizing risk of detection. The wedding had presented an ideal opportunity because it would bring the entire extended family together in one location at a predictable time, and because targeting the wedding of an FBI agent would send a message about the network's capabilities and reach. I sat there listening to this explanation and felt a wave of nausea roll through me. My wedding had not just inadvertently exposed my family, it had been actively used as a weapon against them. The joy and celebration I had been planning for over a year had been transformed into a tactical opportunity for people who wanted my family dead. Every detail I had shared online, every photograph I had posted, every piece of information I had included in our wedding materials had been ammunition for people I had never known existed. Marcus reached for my hand, but I pulled it away. I was not ready to accept comfort from him, not when his career and his institution had apparently known things about my family that I had not. I understood intellectually that he might not have had access to information about my father's history in witness protection, that such information would be compartmentalized and available only to those with specific need to know. But emotionally, I felt betrayed by the fact that the man I was supposed to marry worked for an organization that had kept such fundamental truths about my identity hidden from me for my entire life. Agent Brennan seemed to sense the tension between Marcus and me, because she directed her next comment specifically to me rather than to both of us. She said that she understood this was overwhelming, and that I likely had many questions. She said that she would answer what she could within the constraints of what was legally and operationally appropriate to disclose. She said that the immediate priority was ensuring my safety and determining the appropriate next steps for both my protection and my family's continued security. I found my voice for the first time since entering the office and asked the question that seemed most urgent. Why had no one ever told me the truth about my family's history? Why had I been allowed to live 26 years believing a completely fabricated version of my own identity? Why had my parents never trusted me with information that was apparently so fundamental to our safety and security? Agent Brennan's expression softened slightly, though her professional composure remained intact. She explained that the decision to withhold information from children born into witness protection was not made lightly, but was based on decades of experience with what kept protected families safe. Children who knew they were living under false identities often struggled to maintain those identities convincingly, particularly during adolescence when they were developing their own sense of self and testing boundaries with authority. A teenager who knew her family was hiding from dangerous criminals might confide in friends, might post something revealing on social media, might make decisions that seemed minor but could compromise security. The policy was that children born into witness protection would be told the truth when they reached adulthood, typically around age 18, and could be trusted to understand the stakes and maintain operational security. However, that conversation required careful timing and appropriate circumstances. My parents had apparently struggled with when and how to tell me, particularly as I became more integrated into my own adult life with relationships and career and plans that did not include the shadow of their past. Each year, the conversation became more difficult because revealing the truth would mean acknowledging years of deception and potentially disrupting my entire understanding of my identity and my life. Agent Brennan said that she could not speak for my parents' specific reasoning about why they had delayed the conversation beyond my 18th birthday, but she suspected it came from a combination of protective instinct and fear of how the truth would affect our relationship. Many parents in similar situations made the same choice, prioritizing their children's immediate happiness and normalcy over the abstract possibility of future danger. In most cases, that choice worked out reasonably well because the threats that had necessitated witness protection faded over time as criminals were imprisoned or died or moved on to other priorities. In our case, Agent Brennan said gently, that calculation had proven incorrect. The threat had not faded. It had been dormant but active, waiting for the right opportunity to resurface. My parents' decision to delay telling me the truth had left me vulnerable, because I had made choices without understanding the context or the risks. No one was suggesting I was responsible for exposing my family, she emphasized. The responsibility lay entirely with the individuals who sought to harm them, and partially with the system that had not adequately prepared me for the reality I was now facing. But the outcome was that I needed to make decisions now about my own safety, and my future with incomplete information about my own past. I asked what decisions I needed to make. Agent Brennan exchanged a glance with Agent Rivera before responding. She said that the immediate decision was whether I would agree to be placed into protective custody alongside my family, while the FBI worked to neutralize the threat against them. The alternative was that I could decline protection and return to my normal life, though that would require enhanced security measures and would carry significant personal risk if the criminal network decided that targeting me could provide leverage over my father or could serve their objectives of retaliation. The idea of going into protective custody, of leaving behind my life and my career and my friends and my home, felt absurd and impossible. I had a job as a data analyst for a healthcare consulting firm, a position I had worked years to achieve and genuinely enjoyed. I had an apartment I loved in a neighborhood where I knew my neighbors and felt comfortable and safe. I had relationships and routines and a life that belonged to me, not to my father's past or the FBI's security protocols. The thought of abandoning all of that because of choices my father had made before I was born felt profoundly unfair. But Agent Brennan was clear about the risks of refusing protection. The individuals targeting my family were sophisticated and dangerous. They had successfully located a family that had been hidden for nearly 3 decades. They had planned an operation that would have succeeded if not for FBI intelligence that intercepted their communications. These were not people who abandoned objectives easily, and they had demonstrated patience and resources that suggested they would continue pursuing opportunities for revenge. If I declined protection and returned to my normal life, I would need to accept that I might be under surveillance, might be targeted for kidnapping or worse, and would need to live with constant awareness of potential threats. Marcus finally spoke, his voice strained but controlled. He said that he would arrange for additional security through bureau resources, regardless of what I decided about protective custody. He said that his colleagues in the Criminal Investigative Division would treat this as a priority case and would work to identify and neutralize the individuals responsible for the threat. He said that he understood if I was angry with him, if I felt betrayed by his institution or by his failure to somehow know or prevent this situation, but that his commitment to my safety was absolute and non-negotiable. I looked at him sitting beside me in his tuxedo, this man I had planned to marry hours ago, and felt a complicated mixture of love and resentment and confusion. As I stepped through the doorway in my wedding dress, leaving behind the last remnants of the life I had thought I was building, I made myself a promise. I would find my family, I would uncover the truth, and I would never again allow anyone to hide who I was from me, no matter what they believed they were protecting me from. My name might be fake, my history might be fiction, but my determination was real. And it was just beginning. The federal agents introduced themselves with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to entering crisis situations and taking control. The first was Agent Sarah Brennan, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and graying blonde hair pulled into a tight bun. She wore a dark suit that seemed designed to project authority without drawing attention. Her partner was Agent Thomas Rivera, younger, perhaps early 30s, with the alert posture of someone trained to assess threats in every environment. They both carried credentials that they displayed briefly before gesturing for Marcus and me to sit down in the chairs facing Sandra's desk. Sandra herself had been asked to leave her own office, along with Officer Martinez and the other local police officer. This was now a federal matter, Agent Brennan explained, and the information they needed to share was classified at a level that required strict control over who had access. She apologized for the disruption to my wedding day with a tone that suggested she had delivered similar apologies in different contexts many times before and understood they were inadequate but necessary. I sat down in the chair, my wedding dress making soft rustling sounds that seemed absurdly loud in the tense silence of the room. Marcus sat beside me, his body angled slightly toward mine in a protective gesture that I both appreciated and resented. I wanted protection, but I also wanted answers, and I was not certain those two desires were compatible in this situation. Agent Brennan remained standing, positioning herself where she could see both of us clearly, while Agent Rivera moved to stand near the door, presumably to prevent interruptions. Agent Brennan began speaking in a measured tone that conveyed both sympathy and professional detachment. She said that my family was safe and secure in a federal facility, approximately 2 hours from our current location. All 63 individuals had been successfully evacuated from the hotel that morning based on credible intelligence about an imminent threat to their lives. The operation had been conducted with minimal notice to prevent any possibility of information leaking to hostile parties. My parents had been informed of the situation at 11 o'clock that morning and had been given exactly 30 minutes to gather the entire extended family and prepare for immediate departure. They had not been permitted to contact anyone outside the evacuation group, including me, because any communication could have been intercepted and could have compromised both their safety and the security of the operation. I absorbed this information in fragments, my mind struggling to process the reality that my parents had known for hours that they would not be attending my wedding and had been forbidden from telling me. They had watched me get ready that morning through text messages and phone calls, knowing they were about to disappear, knowing I would be standing at a venue waiting for them, knowing I would be terrified and confused and devastated. The fact that they had made that choice, even under federal orders, felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than any of the revelations about false identities and hidden pasts. Agent Brennan continued, explaining that the threat against my family had emerged from intelligence gathered during an ongoing investigation into organized crime networks with roots stretching back several decades. Without going into operational details that remained classified, she said that certain individuals connected to the organization my father had testified against 29 years ago had recently been released from prison. These individuals had maintained connections to active criminal networks and had apparently spent their incarceration period planning retaliation against those they blamed for their convictions. My father's testimony had been particularly damaging to the organization's leadership. He had provided financial records that demonstrated systematic fraud, money laundering, and connections between legitimate businesses and violent criminal enterprises. His documentation had been meticulous and devastating, leading to convictions that carried sentences of 25 to 30 years. Several of those sentences were now complete, and the individuals who had served them had emerged from prison with both the motivation and the resources to pursue revenge. The FBI had been monitoring these individuals since their release, Agent Brennan explained, tracking their communications and movements through various investigative techniques. For several months, there had been no indication that they had located my family or had any active plans for retaliation. The Witness Protection Program had been successful in providing my parents with a new identity and a secure life far from their original location. But approximately 6 weeks ago, shortly after Marcus and I had sent out wedding invitations and launched our wedding website, the monitored communications had changed. Agent Rivera stepped forward and added details to the timeline. He explained that wedding announcements, particularly those posted online through wedding planning websites and social media, contained significant amounts of identifying information. Our wedding website had included my full name, Marcus's full name and his occupation with the FBI, the date and location of our wedding, and photographs of both of us. My social media accounts, which I had not thought to make private because I had nothing to hide, included photographs of my parents and siblings, tagged with their names and occasional location information. Someone within the criminal network had apparently been conducting systematic searches of social media and public records, looking for any trace of the family that had disappeared into witness protection nearly 3 decades ago. They had been searching for my father's face, despite aging and the passage of time. When photographs of me appeared alongside wedding announcements that included references to my parents, someone had recognized a resemblance. Facial recognition software, increasingly accessible and sophisticated, had been used to compare my features and my parents' features with old photographs from before they entered witness protection. The match had been strong enough to warrant further investigation by the criminal network. They had apparently begun surveillance of my family approximately 3 weeks ago, watching their routines, confirming their identities, and planning an operation that would maximize impact while minimizing risk of detection. The wedding had presented an ideal opportunity because it would bring the entire extended family together in one location at a predictable time, and because targeting the wedding of an FBI agent would send a message about the network's capabilities and reach. I sat there listening to this explanation and felt a wave of nausea roll through me. My wedding had not just inadvertently exposed my family, it had been actively used as a weapon against them. The joy and celebration I had been planning for over a year had been transformed into a tactical opportunity for people who wanted my family dead. Every detail I had shared online, every photograph I had posted, every piece of information I had included in our wedding materials had been ammunition for people I had never known existed. Marcus reached for my hand, but I pulled it away. I was not ready to accept comfort from him, not when his career and his institution had apparently known things about my family that I had not. I understood intellectually that he might not have had access to information about my father's history in witness protection, that such information would be compartmentalized and available only to those with specific need to know. But emotionally, I felt betrayed by the fact that the man I was supposed to marry worked for an organization that had kept such fundamental truths about my identity hidden from me for my entire life. Agent Brennan seemed to sense the tension between Marcus and me, because she directed her next comment specifically to me rather than to both of us. She said that she understood this was overwhelming, and that I likely had many questions. She said that she would answer what she could within the constraints of what was legally and operationally appropriate to disclose. She said that the immediate priority was ensuring my safety and determining the appropriate next steps for both my protection and my family's continued security. I found my voice for the first time since entering the office and asked the question that seemed most urgent. Why had no one ever told me the truth about my family's history? Why had I been allowed to live 26 years believing a completely fabricated version of my own identity? Why had my parents never trusted me with information that was apparently so fundamental to our safety and security? Agent Brennan's expression softened slightly, though her professional composure remained intact. She explained that the decision to withhold information from children born into witness protection was not made lightly, but was based on decades of experience with what kept protected families safe. Children who knew they were living under false identities often struggled to maintain those identities convincingly, particularly during adolescence when they were developing their own sense of self and testing boundaries with authority. A teenager who knew her family was hiding from dangerous criminals might confide in friends, might post something revealing on social media, might make decisions that seemed minor but could compromise security. The policy was that children born into witness protection would be told the truth when they reached adulthood, typically around age 18, and could be trusted to understand the stakes and maintain operational security. However, that conversation required careful timing and appropriate circumstances. My parents had apparently struggled with when and how to tell me, particularly as I became more integrated into my own adult life with relationships and career and plans that did not include the shadow of their past. Each year, the conversation became more difficult because revealing the truth would mean acknowledging years of deception and potentially disrupting my entire understanding of my identity and my life. Agent Brennan said that she could not speak for my parents' specific reasoning about why they had delayed the conversation beyond my 18th birthday, but she suspected it came from a combination of protective instinct and fear of how the truth would affect our relationship. Many parents in similar situations made the same choice, prioritizing their children's immediate happiness and normalcy over the abstract possibility of future danger. In most cases, that choice worked out reasonably well because the threats that had necessitated witness protection faded over time as criminals were imprisoned or died or moved on to other priorities. In our case, Agent Brennan said gently, that calculation had proven incorrect. The threat had not faded. It had been dormant but active, waiting for the right opportunity to resurface. My parents' decision to delay telling me the truth had left me vulnerable, because I had made choices without understanding the context or the risks. No one was suggesting I was responsible for exposing my family, she emphasized. The responsibility lay entirely with the individuals who sought to harm them, and partially with the system that had not adequately prepared me for the reality I was now facing. But the outcome was that I needed to make decisions now about my own safety, and my future with incomplete information about my own past. I asked what decisions I needed to make. Agent Brennan exchanged a glance with Agent Rivera before responding. She said that the immediate decision was whether I would agree to be placed into protective custody alongside my family, while the FBI worked to neutralize the threat against them. The alternative was that I could decline protection and return to my normal life, though that would require enhanced security measures and would carry significant personal risk if the criminal network decided that targeting me could provide leverage over my father, or could serve their objectives of retaliation. The idea of going into protective custody, of leaving behind my life and my career and my friends and my home, felt absurd and impossible. I had a job as a data analyst for a healthcare consulting firm, a position I had worked years to achieve and genuinely enjoyed. I had an apartment I loved in a neighborhood where I knew my neighbors and felt comfortable and safe. I had relationships and routines and a life that belonged to me, not to my father's past or the FBI's security protocols. The thought of abandoning all of that because of choices my father had made before I was born felt profoundly unfair. But Agent Brennan was clear about the risks of refusing protection. The individuals targeting my family were sophisticated and dangerous. They had successfully located a family that had been hidden for nearly 3 decades. They had planned an operation that would have succeeded if not for FBI intelligence that intercepted their communications. These were not people who abandoned objectives easily, and they had demonstrated patience and resources that suggested they would continue pursuing opportunities for revenge. If I declined protection and returned to my normal life, I would need to accept that I might be under surveillance, might be targeted for kidnapping or worse, and would need to live with constant awareness of potential threats. Marcus finally spoke, his voice strained but controlled. He said that he would arrange for additional security through Bureau resources, regardless of what I decided about protective custody. He said that his colleagues in the Criminal Investigative Division would treat this as a priority case, and would work to identify and neutralize the individuals responsible for the threat. He said that he understood if I was angry with him, if I felt betrayed by his institution or by his failure to somehow know or prevent this situation, but that his commitment to my safety was absolute and non-negotiable. I looked at him sitting beside me in his tuxedo, this man I had planned to marry hours ago, and felt a complicated mixture of love and resentment and confusion. He had not lied to me, not technically. He had not hidden information he possessed about my family, but he represented an institution that had shaped my entire life without my knowledge or consent, and that representation felt like a barrier between us that I did not know how to cross. We were supposed to be partners, equals in a marriage built on honesty and trust. How could we build that kind of partnership when the foundation of my identity had been constructed by his colleagues in a program I had never known existed? Agent Brennan said that I did not need to make a decision immediately about protective custody, though she emphasized that time was a factor given the active nature of the threat. She suggested that I might want to speak with my parents, either by phone or in person at the facility where they were being held, before making a final decision. Hearing their perspective and understanding their reasoning might help me process the situation and determine what felt right for my own safety and future. The offer to speak with my parents triggered something in me. Anger, yes, but also need. I wanted to hear my mother's voice. I wanted my father to explain why he had made the choices he made, both 29 years ago when he decided to testify and more recently when he decided not to tell me the truth about our family's history. I wanted to yell at them for lying to me for 26 years. And I wanted them to hold me and tell me everything would be okay the way they had when I was a child and the world seemed simpler. I told Agent Brennan that I wanted to see my parents in person, not on the phone where our conversation would be monitored and recorded by agents concerned with operational security. I wanted to sit across from them in a room and look at their faces and demand answers to questions I had not known I needed to ask. Agent Brennan nodded and said she would arrange transportation to the facility immediately, if that was what I wanted, or we could wait until the following day if I needed time to process before facing that conversation. I said immediately. Waiting would only give me more time to imagine all the things I wanted to say, and to build up anger that might prevent me from actually listening to their explanations. Agent Rivera left the office to arrange for a vehicle and additional security for the transport. Agent Brennan gave me a few minutes to change out of my wedding dress into normal clothing, sending someone to retrieve my bag from the bridal suite where my jeans and sweater remained from that morning, when I had arrived at the venue full of excitement and anticipation. Changing out of the wedding dress in Sandra's small office bathroom felt surreal. The beautiful gown that had been custom-made for this day, the dress I had imagined wearing while walking down an aisle toward Marcus and our future together, was suddenly just expensive fabric that belonged to a version of myself that no longer existed. I left it hanging on the back of the door and pulled on my jeans and sweater, my comfortable clothes feeling strange after hours in formal wear. I washed my face roughly, removing the carefully applied makeup that had been designed to make me look radiant and bridal. The woman who looked back at me from the mirror was pale and tired and angry, her hair falling out of its updo, her eyes red from crying. She looked nothing like a bride. She looked like someone whose entire world had just been revealed as a carefully constructed illusion. When I emerged from the bathroom, Marcus was waiting in the hallway. He said my name softly, and I could hear all the things he wanted to say contained in those 2 syllables. Apology, concern, love, frustration that he could not fix this or protect me from it or make any of it easier. I stopped in front of him and looked up at his face, this face I knew so well, and suddenly felt like I barely understood. I told him that I needed to do this alone. I needed to see my parents and have conversations that were private and unfiltered by his presence or his professional obligations. He started to object, citing security concerns and the need for FBI oversight of any contact with individuals in protective custody, but I cut him off. I was not asking for permission. I was telling him what I needed, and if his institution could not accommodate that basic requirement, then I would find another way to get the answers I deserved. Agent Brennan, who had apparently been listening from inside the office, stepped into the hallway and said that arrangements could be made for me to meet with my parents in a secure setting with appropriate privacy. Marcus would not need to be present if that was my preference, though FBI agents would need to be nearby for security purposes. The conversation itself could be unmonitored if I signed documentation acknowledging that I understood the security implications and took responsibility for maintaining operational security about anything discussed. I agreed to those terms immediately. We walked out of the venue together, past the empty garden where my wedding should have occurred, past the reception hall where dinner should have been served, past the gifts that guests had left before departing in confusion and concern. The sun was beginning to set, casting orange and pink light across the grounds, beautiful and utterly wrong for how this day had unfolded. Agent Rivera was waiting by a dark SUV with tinted windows, the kind of vehicle that screamed federal law enforcement despite the absence of visible markings. I climbed into the back seat without looking back at Marcus, who stood on the steps of the venue watching me leave. Whatever happened next, whatever I discovered in the conversation with my parents, whatever decisions I made about my safety and my future, I needed to face it without the complication of his presence and his divided loyalties between me and his career. The SUV pulled away from the venue, and I watched through the window as the place where I should have gotten married disappeared behind us, replaced by highway and distance and the unknown location where my family was being held, and where I would finally learn the truth about who I actually was. The drive to the federal facility took exactly 2 hours and 17 minutes, though time seemed to move differently inside the SUV with its tinted windows and government-issued silence. Agent Rivera drove with the focused attention of someone trained in defensive and evasive driving techniques, his eyes constantly scanning mirrors and surroundings for anything that might suggest we were being followed or monitored. Agent Brennan sat in the passenger seat working on a laptop, occasionally speaking in low tones into her phone about logistics and security protocols I only partially understood. I sat in the back seat watching the landscape change from suburban wedding venues to highway to increasingly rural terrain, trying to prepare myself for a conversation I had never imagined needing to have. My phone buzzed repeatedly during the drive with messages from Marcus, from Jennifer, from Claire, from colleagues and friends who had heard something went wrong with the wedding and wanted to know if I was okay. I ignored all of them except for a brief text to Jennifer telling her I was safe and would explain everything when I could, but that I needed space right now to handle a family emergency. Even that minimal communication felt like more than I could manage given how completely my understanding of family had been shattered in the past few hours. Agent Brennan turned around in her seat about an hour into the drive and asked if I had questions she could answer before we arrived at the facility. Her tone suggested she understood that I was processing significant trauma and wanted to provide what support she could within the constraints of her professional role. I appreciated the gesture even as I resented the circumstances that made it necessary. I asked her to tell me about witness protection, about how the program actually worked beyond the fictionalized versions portrayed in movies and television shows. She seemed relieved to have a concrete topic to discuss and spent the next 20 minutes explaining the structure and protocols of the United States Federal Witness Protection Program, officially known as the Witness Security Program or WITSEC. The program had been established in 1970 as part of the Organized Crime Control Act and had protected thousands of witnesses and their family members over the subsequent decades. Participants were relocated to new areas of the country, provided with new identities including social security numbers and documentation, and given financial assistance to establish new lives. In exchange, they agreed to sever all contact with their previous lives and maintain absolute secrecy about their participation in the program. The success rate was remarkable, Agent Brennan explained. No participant who followed program rules had ever been harmed while under active protection. The failures, and there had been some, occurred when witnesses violated protocols by contacting people from their old lives or returning to previous locations or otherwise creating opportunities for discovery. My father had apparently been an exemplary participant, following every guideline meticulously and building a completely new life that gave no indication of his previous identity or circumstances. I asked how someone like my father, presumably a regular accountant, had ended up working for an organization serious enough to require witness protection after testifying against them. Agent Brennan hesitated before answering, clearly considering how much detail was appropriate to share. She finally said that my father had not started his career intending to work for criminals. He had been hired by what appeared to be a legitimate business consulting firm in the early 1990s, fresh out of graduate school with a degree in accounting and finance. The firm handled books and financial planning for various businesses, and my father had been good at his work, detail-oriented and skilled with complex financial instruments. Over time, he had begun to notice irregularities in some of the accounts he managed, money moving in patterns that did not align with the stated business activities. Transactions structured in ways that seemed designed to obscure their origins or purposes. He had raised concerns with his supervisors and been told that these were sophisticated tax planning strategies employed by wealthy clients who had nothing to hide but preferred privacy in their financial affairs. My father, young and eager to advance in his career, had accepted these explanations and continued his work without asking further questions he perhaps should have asked. By the time he fully understood that the firm was functioning as a money laundering operation for organized crime figures, he was already deeply implicated in the financial structures he had helped create. His meticulous record-keeping, the very skill that made him valuable to his employers, also meant that he possessed documentation of illegal activities spanning years and involving millions of dollars. When federal investigators finally penetrated the organization and began making arrests, my father faced a choice between being prosecuted as a co-conspirator or cooperating with the government by providing testimony and evidence against the organization's leadership. Agent Brennan said that choosing to cooperate had taken courage, particularly given that my father had understood the risks involved both for himself and for my mother, who was pregnant with me at the time. The organization had a reputation for violent retaliation against those who betrayed it. Witnesses in previous cases had been threatened, assaulted, or worse. But my father had also recognized that he bore some responsibility for enabling criminal activity, even if he had not initially understood the full scope of what he was involved in. Testifying allowed him to take accountability, while also protecting my mother and their unborn child from prosecution as accomplices. I absorbed this information while staring out the window at farmland and forests passing in the fading light. My father, the quiet man who had taught me to ride a bicycle and helped me with math homework and attended every school event I could remember, had once been entangled with organized crime. He had made choices that required him to abandon his entire identity and disappear into a witness protection program. He had built a completely fabricated life so thoroughly that his own daughter had never suspected any of it was false. I did not know how to reconcile these versions of him, the man I knew and the man he had been before I existed. The federal facility appeared as we turned off a rural highway onto a narrow access road marked only by a small sign indicating it was private property. The building itself was unmarked and unremarkable, a low structure that could have been a corporate retreat center or a government training facility. Chain-link fencing topped with barbed wire surrounded the perimeter, and security cameras were visible at regular intervals. Agent Rivera stopped at a gate where 2 armed guards verified our identities and the vehicle before allowing us to proceed to a parking area near the main entrance. Inside, the facility had the sterile functionality of government buildings everywhere. Fluorescent lighting, neutral carpet, walls painted in shades of beige that were probably selected specifically for their lack of character. Agent Brennan led me through a security checkpoint where I was required to surrender my phone and any other electronic devices, then through a series of corridors to a small conference room furnished with a table, several chairs, and nothing else. She explained that my parents would be brought to this room in a few minutes, and that I would have privacy for our conversation. She and other agents would be positioned outside the door for security purposes, but would not monitor or record what was said, unless I requested their presence or assistance. I asked if my entire family was in this facility or just my parents. Agent Brennan said that all 63 individuals evacuated from the hotel that morning were being housed here temporarily, while the FBI assessed the ongoing threat level and determined appropriate long-term security measures. My siblings and their families, my grandmother, my aunts and uncles and cousins, all of them were somewhere in this building trying to make sense of having their lives disrupted because of something that happened before most of them were born. I wondered how many of them had known the truth about our family history and how many, like me, were discovering it for the first time under the worst possible circumstances. Agent Brennan left the room, and I was alone with my thoughts for perhaps 5 minutes before the door opened again and my parents entered. My father looked older than I had ever seen him, the stress of the day visible in the lines around his eyes and the way he held his shoulders. My mother's face was blotchy from crying, her usual composure completely shattered. They both stopped just inside the doorway as if uncertain whether I would welcome their presence or reject them entirely. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other across the small conference room. These were the people who had raised me, who had attended every school play and graduation, who had helped me move into my first apartment and celebrated my engagement to Marcus. They were also strangers who had lied to me about fundamental aspects of reality for my entire life. Both things were true simultaneously, and I did not know which truth should matter more in this moment. My mother broke the silence first, her voice hoarse and shaking. She said my name, or rather she said the name that had been on my birth certificate for 26 years. The name I had always believed was simply my name rather than an identity constructed by federal agents and witness protection protocols. She asked if she could hug me, and the fact that she asked permission rather than simply approaching suggested she understood how fragile our relationship had become in the past few hours. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and she crossed the room quickly to wrap her arms around me. I stood stiffly for a moment before my body betrayed my anger, and I found myself hugging her back, crying into her shoulder the way I had as a child when the world felt overwhelming and I needed comfort from someone who seemed to have all the answers. Except now I understood that she did not have all the answers, or rather that the answers she did have were ones she had deliberately withheld from me for reasons I was only beginning to understand. My father remained by the door until my mother released me and stepped back, wiping her eyes. Then he approached more slowly and placed his hand on my shoulder, a gesture that conveyed both affection and uncertainty about whether more demonstrative comfort would be welcome. His eyes were red, and I realized he had been crying, which was something I had never seen in my entire life. My father was the person who remained calm during crises, who solved problems through careful analysis and methodical action. Seeing him visibly emotional was almost more disorienting than anything else that had happened today. We sat down at the conference table, my parents on one side and me on the other, a physical arrangement that felt symbolic of the distance that had opened between us. For several seconds no one spoke. We were all waiting for someone else to begin the conversation that none of us wanted to have, but that was absolutely necessary if there was any hope of repairing what had been broken. Finally, I asked the question that seemed most fundamental. Why had they never told me the truth about who we were, and where we came from? My father looked down at his hands, those careful hands that had apparently once documented financial crimes, and then built a completely new life from nothing. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady, the voice of someone who had thought about this question for years, and still did not have a satisfactory answer. He said that when I was born, for months after they entered witness protection, the world had felt dangerous in ways that were difficult to describe to someone who had not experienced it. They had just testified in a trial that resulted in multiple life sentences for violent criminals. They had watched those criminals glare at them across a courtroom and understood that the hatred in those eyes was something that would not diminish with time or distance. Federal agents had explained that their safety depended on absolute commitment to their new identities, on never slipping and revealing anything about their previous lives, on building a false history so convincing that even they would sometimes forget it was false. In that context, telling a child the truth had seemed impossible. How could they explain to a 4-year-old or a 7-year-old or even a 12-year-old that everything about their family was a carefully constructed lie? How could they trust that a child would not accidentally reveal something in conversation with teachers or friends or in writing that might be seen by the wrong people? The risk had felt too great, and so they had made the decision to wait until I was older, more mature, better able to understand the complexity of the situation and the importance of maintaining operational security. But then I had become a teenager, my father continued, and teenagers were not known for their discretion or their willingness to keep family secrets when those secrets felt oppressive or unreasonable. They had worried that telling me during that phase of my life would result in rebellion, in me deliberately breaking the rules or testing the boundaries in ways that could expose us all to danger. So they had waited longer, telling themselves they would have the conversation when I turned 18 and became a legal adult. Except when I turned 18, I had been preparing to leave for college, excited about my independence and my future. My relationship with them had been good, uncomplicated by the tensions that affected some families. They had looked at this happy, well-adjusted young woman and convinced themselves that there was no urgent need to disrupt my life with revelations about a past that seemed increasingly distant and irrelevant. The criminals who had threatened us were in prison. We had built a stable, normal life. Why introduce trauma that might serve no purpose except to damage our relationship and burden me with fear about threats that might never materialize? My mother took over the explanation, her voice thick with emotion. She said that each year after my 18th birthday, they had told themselves they would have the conversation soon. After I graduated from college, after I got settled in my career, after I met someone serious and began planning a future that might need to account for our complicated history. But each milestone had brought new reasons to delay. They had been cowards, she said bluntly, not wanting to face my anger or disappointment or the possibility that learning the truth would change how I saw them and understood my own identity. When I had gotten engaged to Marcus, they had finally recognized that they could not delay the conversation any longer. I was going to marry an FBI agent, someone whose career involved background checks and security clearances and institutional connections that might eventually reveal information they had hidden for decades. They had planned to tell me after the wedding, during what they had imagined would be a calm period when I was happy and settled and could process the information without it overshadowing the joy of my marriage. That plan obviously had failed spectacularly. The wedding announcement and the online presence I had created had exposed them to exactly the kind of scrutiny they had spent nearly 30 years avoiding. Their delay in telling me the truth had left me vulnerable, because I had made decisions without understanding the context or the risks. My father's voice broke as he said that he would carry the guilt of that failure for the rest of his life. That seeing me standing in a wedding dress while federal agents explained that my entire family had disappeared because of his choices and his cowardice was worse than any threat the criminals could have made against him personally. I sat across from them listening to these explanations, and feeling the anger I had carried since leaving the wedding venue shift into something more complicated. I was still furious that they had lied to me for 26 years. I was still hurt that they had not trusted me with the truth even after I became an adult capable of handling difficult information. But I was also beginning to understand the impossible position they had been in, trying to protect both my safety and my normalcy, trying to give me a childhood uncomplicated by fear, while also preparing me for the possibility that our false identity might someday be discovered. Understanding their reasoning did not mean forgiving them immediately or accepting that their choices had been correct. But it created space for something other than pure anger, some acknowledgement that they had been doing their best in circumstances that offered no good options. They had made choices that prioritized my immediate happiness over my long-term preparedness, and those choices had proven inadequate when the threat they hoped would never materialize finally emerged. But they had made those choices out of love, misguided perhaps, but genuine in their desire to protect me from burdens they wished I would never have to carry. I asked them to tell me about their life before witness protection, about who they had been when they had different names and lived in a different place and existed in a world I had never known. My father seemed surprised by the question, as if he had expected only accusations and anger rather than curiosity about the past he had hidden. He glanced at my mother, who nodded encouragingly, and then began to speak in a voice that carried the weight of memories long suppressed. He told me that they had lived in New Jersey, in a small apartment in Newark where rent was affordable for a young couple just starting their careers. He had worked for the financial consulting firm that he believed was legitimate, putting in long hours and taking pride in work he thought was helping businesses operate more efficiently. My mother had been teaching elementary school, working with second graders she adored and planning for the family they hoped to start once they were more financially stable. They had friends, simple routines, dreams about buying a house eventually and maybe getting a dog. The unraveling had been gradual, my father explained. Small inconsistencies in the accounts he managed had accumulated into a pattern he could no longer ignore or rationalize. He had begun keeping copies of documents that troubled him, not with any plan to report them but simply because his professional training had taught him to document everything carefully. When federal agents had finally approached him with evidence that his firm was under investigation, he had been shocked but not entirely surprised. Some part of him had known that something was wrong even as he told himself otherwise. The decision to cooperate had been the hardest choice he had ever made, he said. Testifying meant admitting that he had been complicit, even if unknowingly, in criminal activity. It meant accepting that his career in accounting was over, because no legitimate firm would hire someone with his history. It meant uprooting my mother from her teaching job and her friends and her life to disappear into a program that would give them new identities but could never give them back what they were leaving behind. And it meant that their child, the baby my mother was carrying, would be born into a life built on lies, never knowing the truth about where they came from or who their parents had been. But not cooperating would have meant going to prison, my father continued. It would have meant my mother raising a child alone while he served a sentence for crimes he had helped facilitate. It would have meant carrying the guilt of knowing he had enabled harm and done nothing to stop it or make it right. When faced with those options, cooperation had been the only choice he could live with, even though the cost was enormous and permanent. My mother added that leaving behind her family had been devastating. Her parents, my grandparents who I had grown up believing lived in California and whom we visited occasionally, were actually actors playing roles arranged by the Witness Protection Program. Her real parents had not known where she went or whether she was safe for years after she disappeared. The program had eventually arranged limited supervised contact once the immediate danger had passed, but the relationship had never recovered from the years of enforced separation. By the time I was old enough to meet them, They were elderly and confused about who I was and why they were being asked to pretend to be someone they were not. I felt tears streaming down my face as I listened to these stories about lives that had been destroyed by my father's involvement with criminals and his subsequent cooperation with the government. My parents had lost everything they had built in their 20s to protect each other, and to protect me before I was even born. They had spent nearly 3 decades living under false identities, always watching for signs that they had been discovered, always carrying the fear that the violence they had escaped might eventually find them. And they had done all of that while trying to give me a childhood that felt normal and safe and full of possibility. The anger I had carried into this room had not disappeared entirely, but it had been joined by grief for the parents they had been before they became the parents I knew, and by reluctant admiration for the courage it must have taken to build an entire life from nothing while carrying secrets that could never be shared. They had made mistakes in how they handled telling me the truth, serious mistakes that had left me vulnerable and unprepared. But they had also made impossible choices in impossible circumstances, and they had somehow managed to raise a daughter who had never suspected that anything about her life was false. I asked them what happened next, what the FBI planned to do about the threat and about our family's long-term security. My father said that Agent Brennan had briefed them on the ongoing investigation into the criminal network that had located us. Several individuals were already under surveillance, and the FBI was building cases that would hopefully result in arrests and prosecution. In the meantime, our entire extended family would need to remain in protective custody until the threat was neutralized, or until alternative security arrangements could be made. For me specifically, my parents said the decision about what happened next was mine to make. I could choose to enter protective custody with them, accepting new identity and new location and all the disruption that would involve. I could choose to return to my normal life with enhanced security measures and the understanding that some level of risk would remain. Or I could choose something in between, maintaining my current identity and career while accepting certain restrictions on my movements and communications until the situation was resolved. My mother reached across the table and took my hand, her grip tight and desperate. She said that whatever I decided, they would support me. If I needed distance from them to process everything I had learned, they would understand. If I wanted to maintain our relationship despite the lies and the danger and the complicated history, they would be grateful for that grace. If I hated them for what they had done and what they had failed to do, they would accept that as a consequence they deserved. But they wanted me to know that every choice they had made, right or wrong, had come from love and from a desperate desire to protect me from a world they wished I would never have to understand. I sat there holding my mother's hand and looking at my father's face, and feeling the weight of decisions I had never wanted to make pressing down on me from all directions. My wedding day had been supposed to be about celebrating love and commitment, and building a future. Instead, it had become about discovering that my entire past was a carefully constructed fiction, and that my future would need to be built on foundations I was only beginning to understand. But somewhere beneath the anger and grief and confusion, I felt something else emerging, something that felt like determination, like refusal to be defined entirely by my father's choices or the criminals who wanted revenge or the FBI's protocols. Like recognition that I had agency in determining what happened next, even if all my options were difficult and none of them resembled the life I had imagined I would be living. I told my parents that I needed time to think about what I wanted to do, but that I was glad we had this conversation, and that I understood better now why they had made the choices they made. Understanding did not equal forgiving, not yet, but it was a beginning. They both nodded, relief visible in their expressions even as they recognized that our relationship would need to be rebuilt from this moment forward, rather than simply continuing as it had before. We were all different people now than we had been this morning, and whatever family we became going forward would need to account for those differences. Agent Brennan returned to the room as if she had been monitoring the time and knew when our conversation was reaching its natural conclusion. She said that accommodations had been prepared for me if I wanted to stay at the facility overnight, or arrangements could be made to transport me back to my home with appropriate security if I preferred. I chose to stay, not ready to return to the apartment where I had imagined Marcus and I would be tonight as a married couple beginning our honeymoon. My parents embraced me before leaving the room, and I let myself hold them for a moment before stepping back and watching them walk away down the corridor flanked by federal agents. Alone again in the conference room, I sat down and tried to process everything I had learned and everything that still remained unknown. My name was false. My family history was fabricated. My father had been entangled with criminals and had cooperated with the government at enormous personal cost. My wedding had been cancelled because online announcements had exposed us to people seeking revenge for testimony given before I was born. And somehow, in the middle of all this chaos and revelation, I needed to figure out who I actually was and what kind of life I wanted to build from the ruins of everything I had believed was true. The room they provided for me at the federal facility was small and functional, containing a narrow bed, a desk with a chair, and a bathroom barely large enough to turn around in. The walls were the same neutral beige as the rest of the building, and the single window looked out onto a courtyard that appeared to serve no purpose except to provide natural light to the interior rooms surrounding it. There were no personal touches, no decorations, nothing to suggest that human beings regularly occupied this space for any length of time. It felt like a holding cell designed to look slightly less institutional than an actual cell, and I suppose that was exactly what it was. Agent Brennan had escorted me to this room after my conversation with my parents concluded, explaining that most of my extended family was housed in similar accommodations throughout the facility. She offered to arrange for me to see my siblings if I wanted company, but I declined. The thought of facing Claire and David right now, of trying to determine whether they had known the truth about our family, or were discovering it alongside me, felt overwhelming. I needed solitude to process what I had learned, and to begin making decisions about what came next. Sleep proved impossible despite the exhaustion that had settled into my bones. I lay on the narrow bed staring at the ceiling and replaying the conversation with my parents over and over, examining their explanations from different angles and trying to determine what I actually felt beneath the layers of shock and anger and grief. They had lied to me for 26 years, but they had done so believing they were protecting me. They had denied me the truth about my own identity, but they had given me a childhood unmarred by fear or constant vigilance. They had made choices that left me vulnerable, but they had also made choices that allowed me to become someone who had never questioned her place in the world or worried about dangers lurking in her family's past. I thought about the person I had been that morning when I woke up excited about my wedding day. She had been confident and happy, surrounded by people she loved and looking forward to a future that seemed clear and promising. She had worked hard to build a career she enjoyed, maintained friendships that nourished her, and found a partner who made her feel valued and secure. That person had been real, her accomplishments genuine, her relationships authentic. The fact that her name was constructed by federal agents and her family history was fabricated did not erase the validity of who she had become or what she had achieved. But that person had also been naive in ways that now felt dangerous. She had posted photographs and details about her life online without considering that someone might be searching for exactly that information. She had planned a wedding that brought her entire family together in one predictable location, without understanding that such gatherings created vulnerability. She had trusted that the world her parents had built around her was stable and permanent, without recognizing that it was a carefully maintained illusion that could shatter at any moment. That naivety had not been her fault, but the consequences of it had been serious and would have been catastrophic if the FBI had not intercepted the threat in time. The person I needed to become going forward would have to be different, more aware of risks and strategic about managing them, more questioning of apparent stability, and prepared for unexpected disruption, more capable of protecting herself and making decisions based on reality rather than comfortable assumptions. The transformation would be difficult, and would require letting go of some of the innocence and trust that had made my previous life feel easy and uncomplicated. But the alternative was remaining vulnerable to dangers I now knew existed whether I acknowledged them or not. At some point during the long night, I got up from the bed and sat at the small desk, pulling out a notepad and pen that had been left in one of the drawers. I began writing, not coherent thoughts but fragments of questions and observations and decisions that needed to be made. The physical act of putting pen to paper helped organize the chaos in my mind into something approaching structure. I wrote about my relationship with Marcus, and whether it could survive the revelations of the past day. He had not lied to me, but his career represented an institution that had shaped my entire life without my knowledge or consent. Could I build a marriage with someone whose professional obligations might always create divided loyalties between me and his duty to the FBI? Could I trust him to prioritize our relationship when his work involved secrets and security protocols that might prevent him from sharing information that affected me directly? These were not questions with obvious answers, and I recognized that I would need to have difficult conversations with him before I could determine whether our engagement still made sense given everything that had changed. I wrote about my career and whether I could continue working at the healthcare consulting firm that had been the center of my professional identity for the past 3 years. If I entered witness protection with my family, that career would end completely as I disappeared into a new identity in a new location. Even if I chose to maintain my current life with enhanced security, the FBI might require that I limit my professional activities or avoid certain types of work that could create additional vulnerability. The question was whether I was willing to sacrifice career advancement and professional satisfaction for safety, or whether I would insist on maintaining as much normalcy as possible regardless of the risks involved. I wrote about my relationship with my parents and siblings and extended family, all of whom were somewhere in this facility processing their own versions of the crisis that had disrupted all our lives. Some of them had surely known the truth about our family history and had been complicit in maintaining the deception. Others, like me, were probably discovering their entire identity was false and struggling to reconcile that revelation with the people they had believed themselves to be. I would need to determine which relationships were worth preserving and rebuilding, and which might be too damaged by lies and complicated history to maintain in any meaningful way going forward. Most fundamentally, I wrote about identity and what it meant to discover that the name I had carried for 26 years was not the name given to me at birth. I had always been Emily Chun, or so I had believed. That name had appeared on my birth certificate, my school records, my college diplomas, my professional credentials. It was the name my friends called me and the name I used to introduce myself to new people. It was intrinsically connected to my sense of who I was and how I moved through the world. Learning that this name was assigned by federal agents rather than chosen by my parents created a strange disorientation, as if the ground I stood on was revealed to be a stage set that could be dismantled and rearranged at any moment. But as I wrote, I began to recognize that identity was more than just a name on official documents. I was still the person who had earned academic honors in college through genuine hard work and intellectual curiosity. I was still the professional who had built a reputation for careful analysis and reliable judgment in my field. I was still the friend who showed up for people I cared about and maintained relationships across years and distance. The name might be false, but the person who carried that name had been shaped by real experiences and authentic choices. No one could take that away from me, regardless of what secrets my family had been hiding or what dangers we now faced. Dawn came slowly, gray light filtering through the window and illuminating the sparse room. I had filled several pages of the notepad with questions and observations, creating a kind of map of the territory I would need to navigate in the coming days and weeks. The writing had not provided answers, but it had helped clarify what questions I needed to be asking, and what information I would need to gather before making final decisions about my path forward. At 7 in the morning there was a knock on the door. I opened it to find Agent Brennan standing in the hallway holding 2 cups of coffee, her expression suggesting she had also not slept much during the night. She asked if I was ready to discuss next steps, or if I needed more time to process before having logistical conversations about security and future arrangements. I accepted one of the coffee cups gratefully and told her I was ready to talk, not because I had reached conclusions about what I wanted to do, but because I needed more information before those conclusions would be possible. We walked together through the quiet hallways of the facility to a different conference room than the one where I had met with my parents the previous evening. This room was larger and contained more sophisticated equipment, including monitors and communication systems that suggested it was used for operational planning and coordination, rather than just personal conversations. Agent Rivera was already there, along with 2 other agents I had not met before. Agent Brennan introduced them as specialists in threat assessment and witness security, who would be helping to evaluate options and develop recommendations for my situation. The briefing that followed was both technical and sobering. The agents explained that the criminal network that had located my family was more sophisticated and better resourced than typical revenge-motivated groups. They had demonstrated patience, conducting surveillance over weeks rather than acting impulsively. They had used advanced technology including facial recognition software to identify connections between my family and our previous identities. They had planned an operation that would have targeted not just my parents but the entire extended family, maximizing the psychological impact and the message sent about consequences for cooperation with law enforcement. The FBI had successfully disrupted the specific planned operation by evacuating my family before the attack could be executed. However, the underlying threat remained active. The individuals responsible for planning the attack were still at large, and while some were now under surveillance, others had gone to ground and were presumably adapting their plans to account for the failed attempt. The assessment was that risk to my family would remain elevated for the foreseeable future, until the FBI could either arrest the key figures involved or provide sufficient deterrent that further attempts became too costly and risky to pursue. For me specifically, the threat level was somewhat lower than for my parents because I had not been the primary target and because I had not existed at the time of the original testimony that motivated the revenge. However, I was still vulnerable because targeting me could provide leverage over my father or could serve as a substitute target if the primary objectives became impossible to achieve. The criminals had demonstrated their awareness of my existence and my relationship to the family, so assuming I could simply return to my normal life without security considerations would be naive and dangerous. The agents presented 3 primary options with various sub-options and modifications possible, depending on my preferences and risk tolerance. The first option was full witness protection, entering the program alongside my parents and extended family with a new identity and relocation to a new area of the country. This would provide the highest level of security but would require completely abandoning my current life, including my career, my friendships, my relationship with Marcus unless he was willing to leave the FBI and enter protection alongside me, and essentially everything that made me who I currently was. I would become someone new with a fabricated history, exactly as my parents had done 29 years ago, and would need to maintain that false identity potentially for the rest of my life. The second option was to decline witness protection, but accept enhanced security measures, while maintaining my current identity and life. This would involve FBI agents providing periodic protection, sophisticated security systems installed at my residence and workplace, restrictions on my travel and activities, regular check-ins and threat assessments, and acceptance that some level of risk would remain even with these precautions in place. I could continue my career and my relationships, but within constraints that might feel confining and under surveillance that would eliminate most privacy. This option assumed that I was willing to live with ongoing awareness of potential danger, and to modify my behavior accordingly. The third option, which the agents emphasized was not their recommendation but was technically available, was to decline all federal protection and security enhancements and return to my normal life with only the general awareness that threat existed. This would involve signing documentation releasing the FBI from liability for my choices and acknowledging that I understood the risks I was accepting. The agents made clear that they considered this option unwise given the sophistication of the threat and the demonstrated capabilities of the individuals involved, but ultimately the decision was mine to make as an adult capable of assessing risk and determining my own priorities. I listened to these options while drinking coffee that had gone cold in my cup and trying to imagine what each path would actually feel like to live rather than just to contemplate in abstract. Entering witness protection would mean losing Emily Chen entirely and becoming someone else, someone without history or connections or any continuity with the person I had spent 26 years becoming. It would mean safety at the cost of identity protection purchased through erasure of everything I had built and everyone I had been to the people who knew me. Could I do that? Could I voluntarily choose what my parents had been forced into, knowing now what that choice had cost them and what lies it would require me to maintain forever? Enhanced security while maintaining my current life meant accepting that I would never feel entirely safe or private again. Federal agents would know my schedule and monitor my activities. Security systems would track everyone who approached my home or workplace. I would need to limit travel and avoid certain situations that created vulnerability. My friends and colleagues would become aware that something serious was happening in my life that required protection, even if they did not know the specific details. My relationship with Marcus, already strained by the revelations of the past day, would be constantly entangled with his professional world and his institutional loyalties. Could I build a satisfying life under those conditions, or would the restrictions eventually feel like a different kind of prison? Declining all protection meant reclaiming complete autonomy over my life, and choices while accepting that danger existed and might materialize at unpredictable moments. It meant trusting my own judgment about risk and my own capability to protect myself rather than depending on federal institutions to manage my safety. It meant potentially putting myself at risk, but also refusing to allow criminals or government protocols to dictate how I lived or who I could be. Could I live with that uncertainty? Or would the anxiety about potential threats undermine any sense of freedom the autonomy provided? Agent Brennan seemed to sense that I was struggling with the weight of these decisions. She said gently that I did not need to choose immediately, that I could take days or even weeks to consider my options while remaining in the secure facility or in another protected location. She emphasized that whatever I decided, the FBI would support my choice and provide whatever resources were appropriate given the path I selected. The goal was not to pressure me into any particular option, but to ensure I had sufficient information to make informed decisions about my own security and my own future. I appreciated her attempt at reassurance, but I also recognized that delay would not necessarily make the decision easier. The fundamental question was not about logistics or specific security measures, but about what kind of person I wanted to be, and what kind of life felt worth living even under difficult circumstances. That question required me to understand myself at a deeper level than I had previously needed to access, to articulate values and priorities that had been comfortably implicit when my life felt stable and uncomplicated. I asked if I could speak with Marcus before making final decisions about what came next. Agent Brennan nodded and said she would arrange for him to visit the facility later that day if he was available and willing to come. She also offered to arrange conversations with my siblings if I wanted their perspectives, or with a counselor if I thought professional support would be helpful in processing the trauma and making difficult choices. I accepted the offer to see Marcus but declined the other options for now. I needed to determine whether our relationship could survive these circumstances before I involved other people in my decision-making process. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of additional briefings about threat assessment methodologies and security protocols, information that felt both essential and overwhelming in its technical complexity. I learned about surveillance detection, secure communication practices, identity verification procedures, and countless other details that would become relevant depending on which path I ultimately chose. The agents were thorough and professional, clearly experienced in helping protected witnesses understand their options and navigate impossible choices. But underneath their competence, I sensed that they also recognized the fundamental unfairness of my situation and the inadequacy of any available solution to fully address the harm that had been done. By early afternoon, I was exhausted from information overload and emotional processing. Agent Brennan escorted me to a small dining facility, where some of my extended family were eating lunch. I saw my grandmother sitting alone at a corner table, looking small and confused in a way that broke my heart. She was in her 80s and had already lost so much over the years to the witness protection program and the enforced separation from her daughter. Now she was caught up in another crisis caused by choices made decades ago by people she had probably never met. I sat down across from her and took her hand, and we sat together in silence because there were no words adequate to the circumstances we found ourselves in. Claire found me there an hour later and pulled me into a fierce hug that made me realize how much I had needed to see her. My younger sister had always been the optimistic one in our family, finding humor and lightness even in difficult situations. But today her eyes were red from crying and her usual brightness was dimmed by the weight of everything that had happened. She told me that she had not known the truth about our family history until yesterday morning when federal agents arrived at the hotel to evacuate everyone. She had been as shocked and confused as I was, perhaps more so because she had not even had the warning of a canceled wedding to prepare her for the revelation that nothing about our identity was what it seemed. We talked for a long time about our childhood, and whether there had been signs we missed or moments when our parents seemed to be hiding something significant. Claire remembered a few instances when our father had reacted strangely to news reports about organized crime, or when our mother had changed the subject abruptly when conversations turned to their early life together. But mostly our childhood had seemed unremarkably normal, which Claire said was probably the point. Our parents had been so committed to the fiction that they had lived it convincingly enough to fool even their own children who spent every day with them. Claire asked what I was going to do about Marcus and whether I still planned to marry him eventually when the current crisis resolved. I admitted that I did not know, that our relationship felt complicated now in ways I had not fully processed. She said something then that surprised me with its wisdom. She said that maybe the question was not whether I could trust Marcus despite his FBI affiliation, but whether I could trust myself to build a life with anyone given that I now understood how fragile stability could be, and how completely circumstances could change without warning. The question was not about him but about whether I had the courage to commit to any future when I had just learned that the past I thought I understood was largely fiction. Her insight struck me as profound and uncomfortable. I had been framing everything in terms of external threats and other people's choices and decisions that needed to be made about security protocols. But underneath all of that was a more fundamental question about who I was becoming in response to these revelations, and whether that person was capable of the vulnerability and trust that meaningful relationships required. The woman I had been yesterday morning had possessed that capacity easily because she had never been given reason to doubt the solidity of the ground beneath her feet. The woman I was becoming today understood that ground could give way at any moment, and that understanding changed everything about how she would need to move through the world going forward. When Agent Brennan came to find me late that afternoon to say that Marcus had arrived and was waiting in a private room to speak with me, I felt my chest tighten with anticipation and anxiety. This conversation would matter enormously for determining what my future looked like, and whether the life I had been building before yesterday could be salvaged in any meaningful form. I followed her through the facility's corridors, each step taking me closer to a moment that would require more honesty and courage than I was certain I possessed. But I had learned something important over the past 24 hours. Courage was not the absence of fear but the willingness to act despite it. And I was done allowing fear, whether of danger or uncertainty or difficult conversations, to determine what I was capable of facing. Marcus stood when I entered the room, his posture conveying both relief at seeing me and uncertainty about how to bridge the distance that had opened between us over the past 24 hours. He was still wearing the same clothes from yesterday, his shirt wrinkled and his tie loosened, suggesting he had not gone home since the wedding venue. Dark circles under his eyes indicated he had slept as poorly as I had, if at all. For a moment we simply looked at each other across the small conference room. Two people who had planned to spend yesterday afternoon celebrating their marriage, and instead found themselves navigating the wreckage of revelations that had shattered comfortable assumptions about identity, family, and the future we had imagined building together. Agent Brennan closed the door quietly as she left, providing us with the privacy I had requested. The room felt smaller with just the two of us in it, the silence heavy with everything that needed to be said, and the difficulty of knowing where to begin. Marcus started to speak, then stopped, then tried again, his usual confidence notably absent. He said my name, and in those two syllables I heard apology and concern and fear that what we had built together might not survive the weight of what had been revealed. I sat down at the table and gestured for him to do the same. The physical distance felt necessary, a way of maintaining clarity and perspective during a conversation that would require me to be honest about feelings I was still processing and doubts I was only beginning to articulate. Marcus took the chair across from me, his hands folded on the table in front of him, his expression suggesting he was prepared to accept whatever I needed to say regardless of how difficult it might be to hear. I began by acknowledging that he had not lied to me, and that I understood he likely had not possessed information about my family's history in witness protection. The FBI compartmentalized classified information precisely to prevent individuals from having access to details that were not directly relevant to their work. His role in the Criminal Investigative Division focused on financial crimes and organized corruption, not on managing witness protection cases or monitoring individuals who had testified decades ago in trials he would have been too young to participate in or even follow. The institutional knowledge about my family existed somewhere in federal databases and in the memories of agents who had handled my parents' case, but there was no reason that information would have been shared with Marcus simply because he happened to be engaged to the daughter of a protected witness. Understanding this intellectually did not entirely resolve my emotional response to discovering that the institution he worked for had shaped my entire life without my knowledge or consent. The FBI had given me my name, had created the documents that established my legal identity, had constructed the history my parents used to explain where we came from, and why we had no connections to extended family or childhood friends from their past. Every time Marcus put on his badge and went to work at the Bureau, he was participating in the same institutional apparatus that had made my entire identity a fiction. That connection created discomfort I could not simply dismiss or ignore, even when I recognized it was not entirely rational or fair to hold him personally responsible for his employer's actions before we met. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression pained but attentive. When I paused, he said that he understood why his FBI affiliation felt complicated now, and that he could not change the fact that his career had inadvertently been part of what exposed my family to danger through the wedding announcements and online presence. He said that he had spent the past 24 hours questioning whether he should have somehow anticipated this possibility, whether his professional training should have made him more cautious about publicly celebrating our relationship when his career involved investigating organized crime and his background checks might have flagged something unusual about my family's history. The fact that he had missed warning signs, or that the system had failed to connect relevant information, left him feeling that he had failed in his most fundamental responsibility, to protect the person he loved. I appreciated his willingness to acknowledge these concerns, but I also recognized that his self-blame was not entirely warranted. Neither of us could have anticipated that wedding announcements would trigger a sophisticated operation by criminals seeking revenge for testimony given before I was born. The failure, if there was one, belonged to the Witness Protection Program for not better preparing families for the ways that modern technology and social media could compromise carefully constructed anonymity. My parents should have told me the truth years ago, so that I could make informed decisions about what information to share publicly, and what risks those disclosures might create. Blaming Marcus for not preventing a crisis that resulted from decades of systemic failures, and my family's choices about secrecy was neither fair nor productive. The more fundamental question, I told him, was not about blame for what had happened but about whether we could build a sustainable relationship given the circumstances we now found ourselves in. His career would always involve institutional loyalties that might conflict with transparency in our personal relationship. Security protocols and classified information would create barriers to full honesty about aspects of his work that could affect both of us. His colleagues and supervisors would have opinions about my security status, and might pressure him to influence my decisions about witness protection or other measures that served institutional interests, rather than necessarily my own best interests. Could we navigate those conflicts in ways that preserved our partnership and mutual respect? Or would the inherent tensions eventually corrode what we had built together? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly considering the question seriously rather than offering immediate reassurance that might feel hollow given the complexity of the situation. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he had been thinking about these same concerns during his own sleepless night. He said that he could not promise that his career would never create complications for our relationship, or that institutional obligations would never conflict with what I needed from him as a partner. Those tensions were inherent in his chosen profession, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest in exactly the ways that had already caused so much harm. What he could promise, he continued, was that when those conflicts emerged, he would be transparent about them and would prioritize our relationship in his decision-making even when that created professional costs. He had joined the FBI because he believed in accountability, and in using institutional power to address harm and protect vulnerable people from exploitation. But institutions were tools, not ends in themselves, and when institutional priorities conflicted with his personal values or his commitments to people he loved, he would choose the latter even if it meant sacrificing career advancement or facing professional consequences. The past 24 hours had clarified for him that no job, regardless of how meaningful or important he believed it to be, was worth maintaining if it required him to compromise his integrity or betray the trust of someone he had asked to build a life with him. His words carried conviction that I wanted to believe, but that also triggered skepticism born of the revelations I was still processing. It was easy to make promises about prioritizing relationship over career when sitting in a conference room discussing hypothetical future conflicts. Actually following through on those promises when faced with real situations involving classified information, security protocols, and institutional pressure would be significantly more difficult. How could I trust that he would choose differently than my parents had chosen when they decided repeatedly to prioritize my immediate comfort over giving me information I needed to make informed decisions about my own life and safety? I voiced this concern directly, not as an accusation but as a genuine question about what made his promises more reliable than the promises my parents had implicitly made when they raised me to believe that our family's identity was real and permanent. Marcus considered the question carefully before responding that the difference was awareness and commitment to different priorities. My parents had made their choices believing that protecting me from knowledge of danger was more important than preparing me to assess and manage risk independently. They had prioritized security through ignorance over agency through information. He was making a different choice, one that acknowledged my right to information that affected me and my capability to make decisions about my own safety and future, even when those decisions might not align with what he or his institution believed was optimal. The distinction he was drawing felt significant, though I recognized it would only be meaningful if his actions matched his stated principles when actual conflicts emerged. Trust had to be built through consistent behavior over time, not through articulate explanations in crisis moments. What I needed to determine was whether I was willing to take the risk of continuing our relationship while that trust was being rebuilt and tested, or whether the foundation had been damaged too severely by revelations about institutional deception and the ways his career had inadvertently contributed to danger I had not known I faced. I asked him what he envisioned our future looking like given the constraints we now understood. Would he expect me to enter witness protection to maximize my safety, even if that meant abandoning my career and identity? Would he leave the FBI if I determined that his continued affiliation with the Bureau made our relationship untenable? Would he be willing to modify his own career trajectory to accommodate security needs that might require us to relocate or limit our public presence? These were not hypothetical questions but practical considerations that would determine whether the life we could actually build together bore any resemblance to the life we had imagined before yesterday's revelations. Marcus answered each question thoughtfully, and without the defensiveness I had half expected. He said that he would not pressure me to enter witness protection if that was not what I wanted, though he would honestly share his assessment of risks and his concerns about my safety. The decision about how much security to accept and how much normal life to maintain had to be mine to make based on my own risk tolerance and my own values about what kind of life felt worth living. He would support whatever choice I made and would work to help implement whatever security measures felt appropriate to me, rather than imposing solutions designed by federal agents who did not have to live with the daily consequences. Regarding his FBI career, he said that he had already begun exploring what it would mean to transition out of the Bureau if that became necessary for our relationship or for my security. He loved his work and believed it was important, but he loved me more and believed our relationship mattered more than any professional accomplishment. If continuing at the FBI created irreconcilable conflicts with building the kind of partnership we both wanted, he would leave and find other ways to contribute to work that aligned with his values. His identity was not defined entirely by his badge and his institutional affiliation, even though those things had been important to him for the years before we met. As for relocation or lifestyle modifications, he said he was willing to be flexible about where we lived and how we structured our lives together. His career had always been somewhat portable within the federal system, and transitioning to private sector work would create even more geographic flexibility. The specific details of where we lived and what our daily routines looked like mattered less than ensuring that we were making those decisions together, based on shared priorities, rather than having them imposed by external threats or institutional requirements beyond our control. His responses addressed the practical questions I had raised, but underneath those logistics was the deeper question of whether I still wanted to marry him at all. The woman who had woken up yesterday morning excited about her wedding day had possessed certainties about her identity, her family, and her future that no longer existed. The woman sitting in this conference room was someone different, still figuring out who she was becoming and what kind of life she wanted to build from the ruins of comfortable illusions. Did that new person still want partnership with Marcus specifically, or had too much changed for the relationship to survive transformation we were both undergoing? I told him honestly that I did not know the answer to that question yet. I still loved him, but I was not certain that love was sufficient foundation for marriage when so many other aspects of our relationship had become complicated by circumstances neither of us had chosen or anticipated. I needed time to process everything I had learned about my family, my identity, and the threats we faced before I could make decisions about our future together. That time might be days or weeks or possibly longer, and during that period I could not give him certainty about whether our engagement would ultimately result in marriage or would need to be ended so we could both move forward separately. Marcus absorbed this information with visible pain, but also with acceptance that suggested he had anticipated this possibility. He said that he understood my need for time and space to make decisions about my own life without pressure from him or expectations about maintaining our relationship, regardless of how I changed through this process. He said that he would wait as long as I needed and would support whatever conclusion I eventually reached about whether we had a sustainable future together. His love was not conditional on my making particular choices about security or career or even about staying with him. It was simply offered as something I could count on while I figured out who I was becoming and what I wanted my life to look like going forward. We talked for another hour about more immediate practical matters. Marcus had been staying with his colleague Derek since the wedding venue, not wanting to return to his apartment where reminders of the life we had been planning surrounded him. My apartment, which I had not seen since leaving for the wedding venue yesterday morning, was now equipped with FBI security monitoring and would require me to coordinate with agents about when and how I could return there if I decided to maintain my current life rather than entering witness protection. My employer had been contacted by FBI personnel with a vague explanation about a family emergency that required my absence for an indefinite period, buying me time to determine what I wanted to do about my career, without immediately triggering termination for abandoning my responsibilities. Claire and David were both planning to return to their homes with enhanced security, rather than entering witness protection. Accepting the risks involved because the alternative meant abandoning careers and uprooting their own families in ways that felt disproportionate to the actual threat level they faced as more peripheral targets than our parents. My grandmother would likely need to remain in some form of protected environment given her age and vulnerability, but arrangements were being discussed that would allow her more comfort and normalcy than the Stark Federal Facility currently provided. The extended family was scattered in their responses, some choosing protection and others choosing relative normalcy with security enhancements, the different choices reflecting different assessments of risk and different priorities about what made life worth living. Marcus asked if I wanted him to stay at the facility, or if I preferred that he return to the city and give me complete space while I made my decisions. I appreciated that he was willing to follow my preferences rather than assuming his presence would be welcome or helpful. I told him that I wanted some time alone to think, but that I would like him to visit again in a few days so we could continue conversations about practical matters and about our relationship. He agreed readily and stood to leave, hesitating for a moment as if uncertain whether physical affection would be welcome given the uncertainty I had expressed about our future. I stood as well and moved around the table to embrace him briefly, needing the physical connection even as I maintained emotional distance while processing everything that had changed. He held me carefully as if I might break, then released me and stepped back. We looked at each other for a long moment, and I saw in his eyes all the things he was not saying about how much he wanted to fix this situation and protect me and make everything go back to how it was before. But he had learned, perhaps through his own processing over the past day, that some things could not be fixed by wanting them to be different and that protection sometimes meant giving space rather than imposing solutions. After he left, I sat alone in the conference room for a long time considering everything we had discussed and everything that remained unresolved. The conversation had not provided clear answers about our relationship's future, but it had clarified that Marcus was willing to prioritize our partnership over his career when genuine conflicts emerged. Whether I could trust that commitment enough to build a marriage on it remained uncertain. Trust that had been damaged took time to rebuild, and the circumstances we faced would test that rebuilding process in ways that felt daunting to contemplate. But beneath the uncertainty about Marcus specifically, I was beginning to recognize something more fundamental about what I needed going forward regardless of whether our relationship survived. I needed to become someone who made decisions based on information and assessment rather than assumptions and comfortable ignorance. I needed to develop capabilities for protecting myself and managing risk, rather than depending entirely on others to create safety for me through their choices and their institutions. I needed to define my own identity intentionally rather than accepting the identity that had been constructed for me by federal agents and maintained through my parents' well-meaning deception. That transformation would require me to become stronger and more independent than the person I had been before yesterday's revelations. It would mean letting go of some of the trust and optimism that had made my previous life feel easy and uncomplicated. It would demand that I face uncomfortable truths about danger and uncertainty, rather than maintaining illusions of permanent stability. But it would also mean becoming someone who had genuine agency over her own life and future, someone who made choices with full awareness of their implications rather than operating within carefully constructed fictions designed by others who believed they knew what was best for her. The woman I had been yesterday morning was gone, destroyed by revelations about false identity and hidden dangers. The woman I was becoming was still taking shape, still figuring out what strength and independence actually meant in practice rather than in theory. But I was beginning to understand that this transformation, as painful and disorienting as it felt, might ultimately be a gift. Not the gift anyone would choose voluntarily, but the gift of being forced to confront fundamental questions about identity, trust, and meaningful living that I might have avoided indefinitely if circumstances had not shattered my comfortable assumptions. Agent Brennan found me still sitting in the conference room as evening approached. She asked if I had eaten anything since breakfast and seemed unsurprised when I admitted I had not. She escorted me to the dining facility where she insisted I at least have soup and bread, sitting with me while I ate and offering the kind of practical maternal concern that felt oddly comforting from someone I barely knew. She did not press me about decisions or timelines, simply made sure I consumed sufficient calories to maintain basic functioning, while my mind grappled with matters that felt far more urgent than physical needs. That evening, I returned to the small room that had been provided for me, and resumed the writing I had started the previous night. But this time, instead of questions and fragmented observations, I began drafting what felt almost like a manifesto, a statement of principles about the kind of person I wanted to become, and the kind of life I wanted to build from this moment forward. Not in reaction to my family's lies or the criminals' threats or the FBI's protocols, but in alignment with values I was only now articulating clearly because circumstances had forced me to examine what actually mattered to me beneath the comfortable assumptions I had never needed to question before. I wrote about agency and information, about the fundamental right to know truths that affected my life and my ability to make informed decisions about my own safety and future. I wrote about trust and how it could only be built through consistent behavior and transparent communication, rather than through protective deception that prioritized my ignorance over my capability. I wrote about identity and how it was constructed through choices and experiences, rather than through names on documents or stories about family history. I wrote about fear and how it could either paralyze or motivate depending on whether it was faced directly, or allowed to operate as an unacknowledged influence on decisions made to avoid discomfort. The writing continued long into the night, pages filling with thoughts that felt simultaneously obvious and revelatory. By the time exhaustion finally overcame the adrenaline that had been sustaining me, I had created something that felt like a foundation. Not answers about what specific choices to make about security or career or relationships, but a framework for evaluating those choices based on principles that reflected who I wanted to be rather than who others thought I should be or what circumstances tried to force me to become. I fell asleep finally with pages scattered across the small desk, my hand cramped from hours of writing, and my mind quieter than it had been since the moment Agent Brennan first explained that my family had disappeared into protective custody. The path forward remained unclear, but the direction was becoming visible. I would become someone strong enough to face truth without flinching, capable enough to protect herself without depending entirely on others, and grounded enough in her own values to make decisions that honored her authentic self rather than performing versions of herself designed to meet others' expectations or minimize their discomfort. The transformation had already begun. What remained was the hard work of living into that new identity with courage and consistency regardless of how difficult the circumstances became. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.